not abusing the state of emergency to its advantage. Despite the establishment of numerous transitional justice mechanisms in recent years, the promise to ensure accountability, inter alia for the impunity for corruption and abuse of power, has never been fulfilled. Liechtenstein therefore supports the ongoing monitoring of the situation by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. We urge the Sri Lankan authorities to fully implement the recommendations made by the OHCHR and to cooperate with the Human Rights Council and its mechanisms in the process of ensuring accountability and reconciliation. I thank you, Mrs. Vice President.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I now give the floor to Switzerland.
La Suisse remercie.
Madam President, Switzerland thanks the Acting High Commissioner for her detailed and in-depth report. Switzerland is deeply alarmed at the unprecedented economic and political crisis which is sweeping through Sri Lanka, as well as its dramatic consequences on the people whose food security and access to basic services have been affected. Switzerland is worried about recent incidents of violent repression of peaceful demonstrations and arrests of demonstrators and journalists under the new government, in certain cases abusing the law against terrorism. At the same time, the communities of the north and the east continue to call for accountability for the serious violations of human rights and of international humanitarian law that have occurred during the civil war. Just after the end of the war, the process for the search for truth, justice and reconciliation have yielded only very limited progress. The current crisis represents daunting challenges, but can also provide an opportunity to move forward with reforms. It is urgent to strengthen the inquiry mechanisms into violations of international law and transitional justice. Switzerland would call on the government of Sri Lanka to commit itself to implementing these recommendations. Madam Acting High Commissioner, how can the international community support Sri Lanka to enter into inclusive national dialogue which would move forward in respect for human rights and reconciliation? Thank you.
And I now give the floor to Egypt.
Thank you, Madam President. The delegation of Egypt has taken note of the High Commissioner's Office report on Sri Lanka. We reaffirm how important it is to comply with the principles of universality, objectivity, and non-selectivity in the study of the human rights situation in Sri Lanka. It's vital to avoid the politicization of human rights and instead to avoid interfering in the internal policies of the country. It is important to strengthen the capacity of national institutions in Sri Lanka and to provide technical assistance to the country. It is vital for the Council and the OHCHR to strengthen dialogue and coordination with Sri Lanka so as to guarantee positive results and to ensure that it has the requisite support in accordance with its national priorities and in accordance with its sovereignty. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to India. Ambassador.
Madam Vice President, I thank the Acting High Commissioner for her update. India has always believed in the responsibility of states for promotion and protection of human rights and constructive international dialogue and cooperation guided by the principles of the UN Charter. In this regard, the Indian delegation notes with concern the lack of measurable progress by government of Sri Lanka on their commitments of a political solution to the ethnic issue through full implementation of the 13th Amendment of the Constitution, delegation of powers to provincial councils, and holding of provincial council elections at the earliest. India's consistent view on peace and reconciliation in Sri Lanka has been for a political settlement within the framework of an united Sri Lanka, ensuring justice, peace, equality, and dignity for the Tamils of Sri Lanka. The current crisis in Sri Lanka has demonstrated the limitations of debt-driven economy and the impact it has on the standard of living. It is in Sri Lanka's best interest to build capacity of its citizens and work towards their empowerment, for which devolution of power to the grassroots level is a prerequisite. In this connection, operationalization of provincial councils through early conduct of elections will enable all citizens of Sri Lanka to achieve their aspirations for a prosperous future. We therefore urge Sri Lanka to take immediate, credible, action in this regard. I thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to France.
Merci, Madame la Vice-Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. France thanks the High Commissioner's Office for its report. We note with concern the development of the political economic situation in Sri Lanka and expresses its solidarity with the people of Sri Lanka given the serious crisis that the country is now experiencing. And it would assure the authorities of its support. Since 2015, this Council has been working to promote the process of reconciliation underway in Sri Lanka. The Council adopted a cooperation-based approach to help the authorities to come up with solutions which are adapted to the types of discrimination, injustices and violations of human rights that have been documented by the successive reports of the High Commissioner's Office. Thus, we would call on the government to fully cooperate with the High Commissioner's Office for Human Rights with a view to ensuring better protection for all Sri Lankans against discrimination and violence. We would call in particular for a strengthening of the independence of the judiciary to allow for the necessary guarantees to be provided to victims and restoring civic space and full respect for the rights of expression and association in the country. We commend the announcements by the government concerning the reform of the law on the prevention of terrorism and would encourage it to continue along these lines. We call for the need for an open and inclusive dialogue on the human rights situation in Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Merci. And I
Thank you.
give the floor to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The DPRK delegation commends the government of Sri Lanka for its sincere efforts to promote and protect human rights by maintaining the security and stability restored and ensuring sustainable progress despite many challenges, and for its clear commitment to remain engaged with the UN system, including HRC. We reiterate our position to oppose and reject country-specific initiatives and resolutions that are confrontational and do not have the consent of the country concerned. The resolution on Sri Lanka has set a dangerous precedent by requiring the OHR to take on the role of the collecting criminal evidence with a view to future prosecution, a mandate that was never conferred on OHSR by any subsequent resolution of the General Assembly. Politically motivated pressure and biased approach is the counterproductive that undermines the dialogue and cooperation for the genuine promotion and protection of human rights. We urge the HRC or OHSR to encourage genuine dialogue and cooperation with the state, carry out work based on its mandates in an objective, impartial manner, and stand against politicization, selectivity, and double standards of human rights. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to North Macedonia.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. North Macedonia thanks the Office of the High Commissioner for the comprehensive report on Sri Lanka. Whilst we welcome the continued commitment of the government of Sri Lanka to engage with the United Nations and its agencies, we remain concerned due to the devastating economic crisis and its impact on human rights. We are deeply concerned for increased food insecurity, severe shortages in fuel and essential medicines, as well as reduction in household incomes, influencing the lives of the people, including the most vulnerable groups. Accountability is key for reconciliation and must be ensured. We urge Sri Lankan authorities to take all necessary measures to guarantee people's economic and social rights during the economic crisis and to put in place a transparent process for prosecution of international crimes and serious human rights violations. We highlight the importance of greater participation in democratic life and independent transitional justice institutions. Finally, North Macedonia encourages the authorities to continue to engage with the Office of the High Commissioner, and we remain committed to support the further enhancement of the capacity provided in Resolution 46.1. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I now give the floor to Australia. Ambassador.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Australia thanks the OHCHR for its comprehensive report and notes the Government of Sri Lanka's engagement. As a long-standing partner, Australia is committed to supporting Sri Lanka implement its transitional justice and accountability commitments and international human rights obligations. We recognise your concerns, including marginalisation and differential treatment of minority communities, surveillance and intimidation of civil society, recent responses to peaceful protest, including the use of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, and the situation of long-term detainees under the Act. Peace and social cohesion, strong and independent institutions, and an open civic space are vital enablers for sustainable economic recovery and the enjoyment of human rights. We encourage the Government of Sri Lanka to renew its efforts towards truth, justice and accountability, and work with all stakeholders to develop and implement a comprehensive strategy to deliver peace-building and transitional justice measures. Acknowledging recent commitments to further reform of counter-terrorism legislation, we encourage continued efforts to ensure Sri Lanka's legal framework aligns with international standards. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Ireland. Madam Vice President, Ireland aligns with the statement of the EU and welcomes the OHCHR report and the work of the OHCHR Sri Lanka Accountability Project. Ireland recognises the dire impacts of the current economic and humanitarian situation on the people of Sri Lanka. We urge the Government of Sri Lanka to address long-standing grievances in order to secure durable peace and build confidence with minority communities while fully respecting human rights and fundamental freedoms. We encourage Sri Lanka's new government to embark on an inclusive national dialogue to advance the protection of human rights and revive the vital work on the truth and reconciliation and transitional justice processes. While we note efforts by the Sri Lankan government to amend the Prevention of Terrorism Act, Ireland remains concerned by a number of provisions of this Act, which, according to OHCHR, have led to alleged human rights violations. We urge the Sri Lankan government to apply a moratorium on the use of this Act until it is in full compliance with international human rights law. Acting High Commissioner, we are concerned about recent reports by UNFPA of the increased vulnerability of women and girls to sexual and gender-based violence in Sri Lanka. Does your office have recommendations for how the Sri Lankan government and the international community can bring attention to and address this issue? Thank you. And I now give the floor to Japan.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Japan takes note of the Acting High Commissioner's report and appreciates Sri Lanka's engagement in its preparation. Japan is concerned by the devastating economic crisis and emphasizes the need for Sri Lanka to urgently take all necessary measures to guarantee all people's rights. Japan also believes it is vital for Sri Lanka to take further voluntary actions and provide remedies to achieve a meaningful reconciliation and a better human rights situation. In this regard, Japan acknowledges the amendment to the Prevention of Terrorism Act as an important initial step and encourages Sri Lanka to have further efforts to impose moratorium on the PTA, enact comprehensive counter-terrorism legislation, and establish a transitional justice mechanism, including a Truth and Reconciliation Committee. Japan encourages Sri Lanka to continue its effort to improve its human rights situation through the dialogue with all domestic and international stakeholders, including OHCHR. Japan stands ready to support Sri Lanka on both the human rights and economic fronts, including through its ongoing humanitarian assistance for medicine and food. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the Maldives.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The Maldives takes note of the OHCHR report and the oral remarks by the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Madam Vice President, Sri Lanka is a close friend and neighbor of the Maldives. We have always been supportive of Sri Lanka's efforts to overcome the challenges related to the development of the country through its well-established democratic processes. In this regard, we take positive note of the progress made by Sri Lanka in reconciliation and in the field of human rights. The Maldives strongly believes that the support and cooperation of the international community is vital for Sri Lanka to overcome the social and economic challenges that it is facing at the moment. As such, we appeal to all relevant parties to engage in efforts that would bring peace, stability and prosperity to the people of Sri Lanka. We are confident that the government of Sri Lanka will continue to cooperate with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, as well as the Human Rights Council and its mechanisms in accordance with their national priorities to realize the aspirations of the Sri Lankan people. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I now give the floor to Ethiopia.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. We commend the continued cooperation and renewed willingness of Sri Lanka to collaborate with Human Rights Council and the OHCHR. We also recognize its determination to promote and protect the human rights of its people, as well as to implement its voluntary commitments. The efforts of the new government towards legal and institutional reforms deserve recognition. Resolution 46.1 is not supported by Sri Lanka. We are convinced the practice of imposing country-specific initiatives without the consent of the country concerned is counterproductive and undermines the principle of genuine dialogue and cooperation in human rights. National mechanisms and efforts should be recognized and supported. We believe the Human Rights Council and the OHCHR should cooperate and support states based on neutral, independent, and impartial approach in order to safeguard human rights from politicization and double standards. This council must live up to the values and fundamental principles enshrined in the UN Charter, and resolution must be presented and supported for the promotion and protection of human rights of the people on the ground. While underscoring the importance of strict adherence to the provisions of UN Charter and UNGA Resolution 60/251, we encourage the government of Sri Lanka to continue pursuing with its effort to protect the human rights of its people and achieve sustainable peace. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Cuba.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, cooperation and respectful dialogue on the basis of the principles of the United Nations Charter are the only path to follow to guarantee the effective protection and promotion of human rights. The resolution that gave rise to this dialogue does not have the support of the concerned country. Any action or mandate deriving therefrom will be counterproductive. It will only further politicization and proliferation of double standards which have been imposed in the Council and other human rights mechanisms and will not contribute in any way to the promotion of human rights in the country. For its part, the Council should give priority to using universal mechanisms like the UPR as the only guarantee for dealing with human rights questions in all countries in a just and unselective way. Mr. President, Cuba will continue to uphold these principles in all intergovernmental relevant bodies, particularly the Human Rights Council. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Kazakhstan.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. My delegation has taken note of the OHCHR's report and the information provided by the government of Sri Lanka. Kazakhstan supports the efforts of Sri Lanka aimed at protecting and promoting human rights and freedoms, as well as interaction with the UN Human Rights Council on the basis of goodwill and actions to fulfill its international obligations. We hope that such interaction, constructive and purposeful dialogue between the relevant stakeholders will continue. Kazakhstan believes that the Council's work should be based on the spirit of genuine dialogue and cooperation. The support of the country concerned is critical in the efforts of Human Rights Council for the universal protection and the promotion of human rights. We call also upon the government of Sri Lanka to continue a cooperation and positively engage with the United Nations human rights mechanisms. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I now give the floor to Venezuela. Ambassador.
Gracias, señora.
Thank you, Madam President. Good day. Most of this council, including my country, voted against or abstained on the adoption of the resolution which gave rise to the report that's been presented, which has not been consented to by Sri Lanka. Despite that fact, Sri Lanka has shown its full commitment to, in cooperation with this council, its mechanisms, the treaty bodies and the Office of the High Commissioner, which visited the country in May and August of this year. It has also been visited by 11 mandate holders of special procedures in the last 7 years. There is no reason for Sri Lanka to be on the agenda of this council. It is regrettable that there has not been any true assessment of the value attached to the great achievements made by Sri Lanka in upholding human rights since the re-establishment of peace in 2009. Venezuela rejects interference in the internal procedures experienced by Sri Lanka, moving towards full national reconciliation once and for all. We trust in the economic swift recovery of the country with the efforts of the countries to promote the human rights of all of its people, emphasizing vulnerable and minority groups. Once and for all, this council must abandon this interventionist approach concerning Sri Lanka and give assistance to the country that it requires on the basis of genuine dialogue and cooperation, which are the fundamental guide in our work. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Vietnam.
Madam Vice President, Vietnam acknowledges Sri Lanka's strong commitment to the promotion and protection of human rights in line with the country's constitution and international obligations, as well as its engagement with the Human Rights Council and the OHCHR in a spirit of cooperation and constructive dialogue. We welcome the progress made by Sri Lanka on the implementation of voluntary commitments since the 46th session of the Human Rights Council, despite severe challenges due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic difficulties. We also commend Sri Lanka's efforts in strengthening national unity and reconciliation through various coordinated measures, including legislative reform, land release, and various forms of reparation for victims of past conflicts. Sri Lanka has also made encouraging headway on the implementation of the SDGs. We hope that the cultural and international partners will continue enhancing constructive dialogue, technical cooperation, and capacity building in Sri Lanka for strong recovery from COVID-19 pandemic, socio-economic development, and realization of SDG in the country, thus better enabling the enjoyment of human rights by the people of Sri Lanka. I thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I now give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Madam Vice President, we have no desire to dramatize the situation of human rights in Sri Lanka, the government of which has shown its willingness to establish mutually respectful cooperation with international human rights mechanisms. We note the success of the country in this area despite internal political and economic problems and the consequences of COVID-19. In particular, in accordance, counterterrorism legislation is being brought in line with international standards. There have been changes introduced to accelerate proceedings, to allow for release under bail, and to ensure that dependents can communicate with families and attorneys. At the same time, governance is being improved. Sri Lanka has made major progress toward national reconciliation. There is a specialized office operating, as well as a presidential commission for investigating human rights violations. They are resolving the issue of return of IDPs to their homes. We note the tolerance and restraint shown by the law enforcement of the country with regard to rioters in May to August of this year, who during allegedly peaceful demonstrations destroyed or more than one of these riots were entirely justified legally. In this context, we continue to take a negative view of Resolution 46/1, which was adopted without the consent of Sri Lanka and flies in the face of the principle of non-intervention in the affairs of states. We believe that the investigation and punishment of violations is the prerogative of states, of the government of the country. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to China.
Madam Chair, China appreciates Sri Lanka's unremitting efforts in actively promoting and protecting human rights, especially in promoting reconciliation and reconstruction and anti-terrorism. As traditional friendly neighbor of Sri Lanka, China firmly supports Sri Lanka in safeguarding national sovereignty and independence, maintaining social stability and realizing economic recovery. We believe Sri Lanka government will be able to lead the people to overcome temporary difficulties. The HRC resolution 46/1 is the product of politicization. It fails to follow the principles of impartiality, objectivity, and non-selectivity. It is not recognized by the countries concerned and has not played a positive role in promoting and protecting human rights in Sri Lanka. China opposes any country taking advantage of the situation in Sri Lanka to seek geopolitical self-interest and urges relevant parties to respect its independence choice of human rights development path according to its national conditions and to abandon the practice of political pressure and interference in its international affairs. Thank you, Madam Vice Chair.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Nigeria.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Nigeria commends the government of Sri Lanka for its genuine cooperation and constructive engagements with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and other human rights mechanisms. We take positive note of the efforts of Sri Lanka to fulfill its international human rights obligations and deepen cooperation in the field of human rights, particularly its commitment to the Human Rights Council. My delegation would like to again reiterate that the Human Rights Council was established to promote and protect human rights through cooperation and genuine dialogue to strengthen the capacity of member states to comply with their human rights obligations. In this regard, it is fundamentally imperative that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights ensures that the implementation and execution of its mandate is at par with the spirit, the tenor and letter of founding resolution GA 60/251. Needless to say that the sovereignty of Sri Lanka and indeed all member states can only be guaranteed by upholding the principles of universality, objectivity and non-selectivity in the consideration of human rights issues, as well as the elimination of double standards and politicization in this esteemed council. Finally, we commend the government of Sri Lanka on its efforts to strengthen the country's legal frameworks in the field of human rights and call on member states to support the exertion of this country in fulfillment of its international human rights obligation. I thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the Syrian Arab Republic.
Madam Vice President, my delegation.
السيدة نائبة المفوضة، نرحب بمشاركة السيد علي صبري وزير خارجية سريلانكا بهذا الاجتماع، ونشكره على الإحاطة التي قدمها حول التطورات في بلاده، ونثني على الإجراءات التي اتخذتها حكومة بلاده للتغلب على التحديات والمصاعب الاقتصادية والاجتماعية. نحث المجلس على المساهمة وبروح الحوار البناء والتعاون في دعم جهود الحكومة السريلانكية لاستعادة الاستقرار من خلال الحوار الوطني وتلبية الاحتياجات الأساسية لشعبها. ونجدد رفضنا الأجندات التدخلية الغربية التي تستغل قضايا حقوق الإنسان لأهداف سياسية وللتدخل بالشؤون الداخلية لبلدان الجنوب. لقد شكل تبني مجلس حقوق الإنسان القرار 46/1 من قبل المجلس ومن دون موافقة الدولة المعنية سريلانكا مخالفة لمبادئ ومقاصد
of the United Nations and a violation of the founding principles of the Council. The establishment and imposition of politicized mandates through non-consensual resolutions without the consent of the state concerned is a failed approach that must be stopped. Syria notes Sri Lanka's readiness to cooperate with the mechanisms of the Human Rights Council based on respect for national sovereignty and non-interference in its internal affairs, and urges the Council to support efforts to address Sri Lanka's internal situation through national mechanisms. Thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Nicaragua.
Señor Presidente, señores representantes del Consejo de Derechos Humanos de las Naciones Unidas, el Gobierno de la República de Nicaragua.
Mr. President, the government of the Republic of Nicaragua reaffirms in this 51st session of the Human Rights Council of the UN that this body was set up to foster dialogue and cooperation in the area of human rights. Nicaragua, as a member of this council, reaffirms that it is the duty of all nations to promote friendly relations based on respect for the principle of equality of rights and obligations as set out in the United Nations Charter, not to interfere in the affairs that are basically under the domestic jurisdiction of states. The Democratic Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka is moving forward in the area of peace and prosperity and is working with the Office of the High Commissioner for the United Nations for Human Rights in a spirit of cooperation and constructive and voluntary dialogue. In the actions of this Council, we should see professionalism and objective observations from the High Commissioner ensuring compliance with the principle of non-politicization. Nicaragua strongly objects to any expression of politicization which undermines the nature of this Human Rights Council or hinders the technical work done by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, reaffirming the appeal that we have already put forward to respect the objects and proposals set out in establishing this United Nations system body. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the United States of America, Ambassador.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The United States is committed to supporting the Sri Lankan people in their efforts to strengthen their democracy. We recognize the profound economic and political challenges the country is facing, and we welcome the government's efforts at reform. The rule of law, equal access to justice, independent institutions, transparency and accountability are pillars of democratic systems. We value the HRC's attention to and engagement on Sri Lanka, including the OHCHR's recent report and its efforts to help survivors and the families of missing persons. We urge respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, including rights to peaceful assembly and expression. We call for accountability for protest-related violence in line with rule of law and equal access to justice. It is essential that the Prevention of Terrorist Act align with international human rights obligations and commitments to protect fair trial guarantees and other applicable legal protections. As a key step toward improved human rights, it is also important to address long-standing impunity and corruption in Sri Lanka. We will continue to support justice, accountability, and reconciliation in Sri Lanka. Madam Acting High Commissioner, how can we best support Sri Lanka's political reform efforts and ensure they are representative, inclusive, and responsive to the needs of all, including members of minority groups? I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Nepal.
Madam Vice President, Nepal thanks the Acting High Commissioner for the presentation of report. We appreciate the continued engagement of Sri Lanka with the Human Rights Council, OHCHR, and other human rights mechanisms, including the facilitation of recent visits by officials of OHCHR. Despite economic constraints and other national challenges, the continued efforts and commitment of Sri Lanka in the protection of human rights in the country and in attaining 2030 SDGs are appreciable. We also take positive note of the proposal of amendment to the Constitution to strengthen democratic governance and independent oversight of key institutions. Madam Vice President, as per Nepal's own experience, we believe that Sri Lanka would be able to achieve sustainable peace through an inclusive, domestically designed and executed reconciliation and accountability process. We appreciate the progress made thus far. To conclude, my delegation reiterates that the work of the Council and other human rights mechanisms should be guided by the spirit of genuine dialogue and cooperation, should uphold objective, non-selective and impartial approach, and should avoid politicization on human rights issues. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, Ambassador.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The United Kingdom welcomes the High Commissioner's comprehensive report. We recognise the economic challenges facing Sri Lanka and the hardships these have caused. In coming together to protest about the economic situation, Sri Lanka's people exercise their rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and association and freedom of expression. We are dismayed that in response, violence was used against protesters. We are deeply concerned about the arrest and ongoing detention of protesters under the Prevention of Terrorism Act and continue to call for reform of the Act. We are also concerned about reports of continued militarisation and intimidation impacting on communities in the north and east, including on families of the disappeared. We regret the limited progress made on accountability and justice as requested in HRC Resolution 46/1. The domestic reconciliation accountability process promised in 2020 has not emerged. For these reasons, OHCHR's work collecting and preserving evidence must continue. We welcome Sri Lanka's recent commitment on respect for the rights of those from all religious and ethnic groups, including through political inclusion and constitutional reform. We stand ready to continue dialogue and to support Sri Lanka with this and with the promised approaches to accountability, justice and reconciliation. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Bangladesh.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Bangladesh takes note of the constructive engagement of the government of Sri Lanka with the OHCHR throughout the preparation of the OHCHR report. We commend Sri Lanka for its engagement with the human rights bodies and mechanisms, including arrangement of the visit of OHCHR team. Madam Vice President, Sri Lanka is passing through difficult times. Bangladesh dispatched emergency medical supplies to Sri Lanka to express its solidarity with the people of Sri Lanka. We underline that Sri Lanka needs international cooperation and support in its economic recovery. As a friendly neighbor, we wish Sri Lanka every success in its efforts to achieve sustainable peace and reconciliation in the country while promoting and protecting human rights. Finally, reaffirming our conviction that politicization of human rights agenda does not eventually help in promoting and protecting human rights, we request the OHCHR as well as member states to enhance dialogue and cooperation with Sri Lanka, including through technical cooperation and capacity building in accordance with the principles of impartiality, objectivity, and non-selectivity. I thank you, Madam.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Pakistan, Ambassador.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. We take note of the High Commissioner's report and welcome Sri Lanka's comments on it. We recognize the gravity of economic constraints being faced by Sri Lanka, especially in the aftermath of COVID pandemic and global financial crunch. We appreciate Sri Lanka's commitment to advancing the enjoyment of human rights in the country, especially safeguarding the livelihoods and overcoming the socio-economic challenges. We express our unwavering support and solidarity to the government and people of Sri Lanka. We recognize Sri Lanka's domestic accountability and reconciliation efforts. 13 years since the adoption of its first HRC resolution, the Council must now assess in what concrete ways it has fostered enjoyment of social and economic rights by the people of Sri Lanka. We commend Sri Lanka's continuing commitment to remain engaged with the Council and the OHCHR. Visits of 11 special procedures in the last 7 years is a clear reflection of this commitment. Sri Lanka's commitment and constructive approach provides space for meaningful engagement. We therefore call upon the Council and its allied mechanisms to deepen this engagement, support Sri Lanka's national efforts to overcome socio-economic challenges, and advance its national accountability and reconciliation efforts. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to South Sudan.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. South Sudan has taken note of the High Commissioner's report and would like to thank the government of Sri Lanka for its continued cooperation with the human rights mechanisms. We commend the government of Sri Lanka on facilitating the most recent visit by the officials of the Office of the High Commissioner in May and August 2022. It is necessary to point out that the needed constructive dialogue in the area of the promotion and protection of the human rights must always be within the concern of the country concerned. We welcome the significant achievement made by Sri Lanka in the post-war reconciliation and reconstruction and reconciliation, and call on the Human Rights Council to cooperate with Sri Lanka with the aim of promotion program towards reconciliation and development in the country, and avoid practices of double standard, selectivity, and polarization in the work of this council. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Burundi.
Merci.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Burundi believes that respect for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of states, as well as non-interference in the internal affairs of sovereign states, constitute fundamental norms governing international relations. Country-specific mechanisms against certain countries violate the principles of the UN Charter. We welcome the major progress made by Sri Lanka when it comes to human rights. This country has continued to cooperate with the Human Rights Council as well as the OHCHR and has moved forward in implementing its voluntary commitments under the HRC. In reports based on misinformation and tarnished reputation of this council, we call on the OHCHR to cooperate constructively with Sri Lanka in its programs of reconciliation and development based on national priorities, and to avoid the politicization of this council. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Belarus.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. We would like to reaffirm that Belarus does not support country resolutions or the establishment of country mandates without the consent of the government of the concerned state. These resolutions, which are established by these mandates, are politicized initiatives that interfere in the internal affairs of these states. Belarus welcomes the efforts of the government of Sri Lanka to restore the functioning of its economy. This will help to improve the provision of human rights throughout the country. We also note the goodwill of the government when it comes to explaining to the HRC and OHCHR the situation in the country, including in responding to the questions of the HRC and OHCHR and organizations that have visited Sri Lanka. We believe that constructive cooperation with the government of Sri Lanka on the part of the international community and the UN system, including the OHCHR, as well as the provision of international technical assistance and support for economic reforms, will help to stabilize the situation in the country and will ensure sustainable improvements in the country. Many resolutions and political pressure and forced monitoring of Sri Lanka are all counterproductive. Thank you.